Started, if everybody, there we go. Can everybody please take a seat? Bring the chocolate with you. Actually, we'll take some chocolate too if you want. Hi, everybody. So our panel has decided that you guys have probably had enough data for the day, so we're actually going to do a bunch of like show tunes. Is that okay? Right, guys? All right. Hi, I'm Kathy Boockvar, and I'm Senior Advisor to Governor Wolf here in Pennsylvania on election modernization, which is a long way of saying that I get to work on elections initiatives across the state with the Department of State and with the amazing county election officials across the state as well. And I want to thank again the organizers of the event. You did a great job not only in the substance of the panels, but one of the things that I really loved was the diversity of the people who were presenting, because it's really, the data is fantastic, but if you can't translate the data to the poll workers and the people on the ground and the voters, it's not going to go anywhere. So I just want to say thank you and have everybody give a round of applause to everybody who presented today. So this panel is about the end of the day, the end of election, the post-election. And you know, most candidates mostly care about, and voters typically mostly care about the results of the election. But election officials and other data experts know that we need to use tools that we've gained from throughout the day and afterwards to make each election better. And so this panel is made up of diversity of backgrounds who are going to tell you what they've done in their states and what they've done in their professions. So I'll start with introductions. So we have Ray Valenzuela, who's the Director of Elections in Maricopa, Arizona, Maricopa County, Arizona. And Ray has been with the Maricopa County Elections Department for 28 years, so you probably know a thing or two, and has been the election director since April 2017. And Ray is a graduate of the Election Center from Auburn University, and also Maricopa County Management Institute graduate, and is also a Secretary of State Certified Election Officer since 1996. Ray has served for the past 12 years as one of 2 Arizona representatives on the EAC Standards Board, and in 2015 was elected to serve on the Executive Board and currently serves as Secretary. Next, we have Jennifer Morrell from the Election Validation Project at the Democracy Fund. Jennifer's an election professional, and she's partnering as a consultant with the Democracy Fund to lead this project aimed at increasing trust in elections through rigorous audits, standards, and testing. Previously Deputy of Elections in Arapahoe County, Colorado, Jennifer was instrumental in Colorado's successful implementation of the first statewide risk-limiting audit, and she's going to tell us all about that today. Jennifer is also an Election Center CERA graduate and holds a Master of Arts in Management and Leadership, and is also on the advisory committee for the Center for Civic Design. Jennifer's also a veteran of the Air Force. Thank you. Next to me on my left is Cara Rahn, who's the director of the Department of Voter Services in Chester County, Pennsylvania. Cara has 19 years of organizational communication, operation, and management experience, and has enjoyed success in government, corporate, and not-for-profit arenas. Cara, prior to this position, was a process improvement manager at Exelon's Limerick Nuclear Generating Station. I'm interested to hear how that translates into elections.
More than you think.
She served as the deputy director in Delaware County Transportation Management Association and held several government affairs and legislative roles for PICO. Cara attended Shippensburg University, and where she earned her bachelor's in communications and public relations, and earned an MBA from Eastern University. Excuse me. And last but not least, I have Bridgett King, who Bridgett is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Master of Public Administration program at Auburn University. Bridgett teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in state and local government, American government, the presidency, political participation, and public policy. She's also an instructor in the Election Center Certified Elections Registration Administrator, the SIRA program at Auburn. And before Auburn, she was a voting rights researcher at the Brennan Center for Justice. While completing her graduate studies at Kent State University, Bridgett coordinated the McNair Scholars Program, which aims to boost the number of low-income, first-generation, and underrepresented college students who pursue doctorate degrees. That sounds very cool, Bridgett. Please welcome the panel. All right, well, Ray, shall we start with you?
Sure. It's always hard to be the last panel right after cookies, so I know we'll still try to keep you up and awake. And before I start, I just had a question for the audience, and I myself appreciate, and it's an honor to be here, because, and you'll see me taking notes, it's not for rebuttal, but because I'm learning quite a bit myself. So I'm very interested in Jennifer, so I should just pass the mic, but I'll go forward in our risk limiting. But part of it is one of the things we do learn and what you have learned, if anybody, the audience knows what R&D stands for, and they're probably wrong. It's not research and development. It's rob and duplicate. In elections, that's exactly how all these notes here we're going to take away. And what I'm going to show you is some of the wonderful things that we're doing in Maricopa County as far as provisional balloting. And some of it you're going to say, hey, that looks familiar, because we probably robbed it from you. So, but just so that you know, we'll start off here with, the photo up there is not me, that's our new recorder. He is that tall as a city building in Arizona. And if you haven't met him yet, I know that he was just at the SARA training, and if you haven't, he'll find you. So, but part of the process we're going to talk about is a provisional ballot post-election. But before we get there, I want to tell you briefly our story of how we got to the provisional ballot tools that we're using and where we were in 2016. I won't reiterate what everybody's already, some of you experienced. That 4-hour line, that was us in Maricopa County 2016, our presidential preference. We were in the media. Some of it had to do with bad data. One of the things that I will point that we've done data analytics, but you don't update those analytics and say, hey, there's a factor there. We'll call it the Trump factor, if you will. That most of the time in our presidential preference, we're late to the game. It's over by the time it's in Arizona. So it's for lack of a better word, a dog and pony show. There's already the heir apparent or somebody nominated. That did not happen. And there was such a robust interest in the process, which is great, and we didn't adjust our analytics. So the story is where we were, what we were looking for, where we are now, and then we'll get to the provisional balloting, the tools we're using. So we have, and again, I'll go through some of these pretty fast, but the presentation's on the EAC if you really want all of the data. But it's polling places, 724. We have 2.2 million registered voters. We have 1.6 million of those on our permanent early voting list. So it's a big, daunting task to manage that kind of volume. We still do pre-printed ballots in 2016. We had all of these lines. So what we were looking for is we were trying to create a system that increased voter access, engagement, was economical, and scalable. So we weren't just looking for a unicorn. We were looking for a golden unicorn. Those are really rare. So, and again, we wanted that. And not to denounce some of the e-poll books that are out there, but we actually invested in some, and it didn't work for a county of our size. We needed something different. We needed something that would allow us to do things on a real-time basis. We were having, as an example, when we get to the provisionals, we were upwards of 100,000 provisionals in Maricopa County for 2012. 2016, we did better. We had 56,000 provisionals. And those are things that are worked after election and long hours of processing those. And it is, again, doing a better job on the front end to get those people to update their addresses, which we're focusing on. But that's still something that we needed to mitigate. So what we did is we took an approach of saying, and we have 15 counties in Arizona, and Arizona is the largest, or Maricopa, and the other 14 counties call us the great state of Maricopa because we make up the majority, and we have quite a bit of a robust IT staff. So not that every county has that luxury, but what we've done is we challenge our IT staff to say, give us a better process, a better check-in than what we currently have, even in our e-poll book environment. what they did is they created this check-in process that ties directly to, similar to what was presented earlier on a ballot on demand environment, but it is robbing and duplicating from an industry. If you flew here today, you probably didn't talk to an agent, you did a pre-check. And even some of our mailing of our early ballots, Orange County, we stole from them with their ReliaVote. Thank you very much, Orange County. Many years ago that they were using a system for Pitney Bowes that they used to send out credit cards. Those are as important as ballots. So they remodified that. So this is kind of looking at a pre-check-in system. Instead of having one e-poll book and a clerk behind here, or two, as we did in the presidential preference, which had long lines, we can set up 3 to 6 terminals that are pre-check-in. You basically are coming in, the system is set up with the site book that has barcode scanners that can scan driver's license, voter ID, even digital voter IDs, which we're now offering as an app or in your wallet. You basically interface, there's privacy screens. This is a model here, if you, Mr. Commissioner Hicks. I made him about 10, 20 years younger here, so he doesn't get that too old card. I didn't want him to get that. But so an example, this is what you would see as a voter. You pre-check in, and we have a gatekeeper for the people that are, is anybody from Arizona here? No? Okay, good, just me. But nationally, if you're watching, we do have a gatekeeper. We do still require checking IDs at the polling place. It's a part of our state law. So Commissioner Hicks would come in, is this your name? And 95%, our data shows, and these, even from our e-poll books, and 95% of our voters swipe with a driver's license. So those voters walk right in, they swipe, is this your address? And this is how we get to our story about provisionals. For those percentage, 26,000 of our 56,000 provisionals, 2016, were address changes. That's all they were. But they were a 3-part form, paper form, that, and excuse me, Ethel, and I use that name lovingly, but Ethel, who's usually 80 years old, is filling this out, and it takes time to spell Valenzuela, and it's usually not right. And there's a point of where this is where we eliminate a lot of our provisional. So here's where a voter usually would see a fillable form, basically. Because with our sitebook technology, we're not going through a third-party vendor, we're not going through a cloud, we're coming right into our voter registration database. So we're able to update. I will tell you the parties left blank here purposely for Commissioner Hicks. It used to say party, when he was 30, just yes. That's all it used to say. But anyways, and a place to sign. So I'm gonna go through really fast because I only got a couple of minutes to get to our provisional part, but basically the voter checks in, they pre-check in, the ballot is automatically sent that is correct for them. We have 7,000 styles in our upcoming election primary. It doesn't matter, they can go through here and they step over here to wait for their name to be called. It's the Starbucks of voting. I was gonna put a Starbucks logo, but copyright infringement and such, but it basically is, you place your order, step to your side, our check-ins, and just so you get here, as far as the data we're getting from these site books, we can actually get all the way down to minute-by-minute check-ins, because it's not going through a cloud, it's not going through third party. We're getting actual live, open and closed data as far as seen on our dashboard. We're getting, even using it for board worker payroll. So you can see Benny here worked 15.3 hours, one of our hardest workers. So, but it's a multiple tool that is not only sped up check-ins. In our 2017 election, local election, it was a small election, only 1 million voters eligible for that election. We call a baby election. It took an average of 31 seconds to check in, and we only had 44 provisionals for that election. For those local elections, again, similar type elections, about 3,000. So that's a drastic 98% reduction. 2018, we had a congressional district special election. Our Congressman Franks offered or opted to resign for some reason. We'll leave it at that. And we had to have special elections. So in that, we had actually 531 provisionals. Similar type election would have been about 52,000 because we're updating registration right on the bat. We got all these analytics that allowed us to then look at these provisionals. So we can now grab data specific to provisionals and say, even if we get a like kind of election and we have, let's say, 10,000, we're currently looking at that data and we're saying, where are the high attrition rates? Where are people, more provisionals being cast? We can look at that data real time and say why. We have areas that are apartments around gateway testing grounds, which they have high transient employees, so those people tend to move a lot. So we know we can focus there with this data. Last but not least, we can also know then we can increase board workers in that area. We can have options for 3, 6, or 12 pre-check-in. So basically our provisional tools allow us, no matter what, with this particular option of where we were, how we got here, to do a lot of things, and we'll save a couple things for questions, answers, but the one big thing is on the provisional tool, this site book has given us that ability to do real-time processing, but more importantly, to do it on the fly. And by that I mean is, for those of you that do old-time provisionals, a whole 2 years ago for us, you had to wait till after election day or election night. We are actually getting that provisional the minute the voter casts a provisional. Let's say they're not registered. And that's why. It's not that they do an address change. If they do an address change, they're fixing it right then and there. It's not a provisional. But not registered because they said their name is Ray, R-A-Y, and we got them as Reynaldo. So we are actually getting that data instantly at 6:01 a.m., working it and dispositioning it. We don't have election night provisionals any longer, other than the voter that votes at 6:59 provisionally. But so we've closed our polls in the last CD8 at 7:01, one of the data's there, or 7:05 I think was our latest. And we have our provisionals done by 7:10 p.m. that night. So again, some good tools to look at, and hopefully, we are looking to program our site book, and we actually my recorder is in NACO today receiving an award for that site book, and he's looking to open source that, not to, again, to any e-poll book vendors out there to try to take any business, but when we perfect it, know that as a rob and duplicate, as penance for so much that we've stolen from other counties, we're willing to give back, so know that that's going to be an option if and when we work out any and all bugs. But that's our provisional tool that we're using as far and data that we're capturing from it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Jennifer?
Took me a minute. That was pretty awesome. That is so exciting. And we're going to talk a little bit about tools as well in my presentation. First of all, though, it's an honor to be here, and I want to thank the EAC for inviting me. About 10 weeks ago, I took off my hat as an election official and partnered with the Democracy Fund in what is turning out to be a really exciting project, looking at ways that we can increase trust in elections through audit standards and testing. And so the focus of my thoughts this afternoon, when we think about post-election data, we think about the way that we evaluate our elections, the way that we audit our elections. I want to think about it through the lens of increasing trust. And I've included this statement from Democracy Fund's Trust in Election project, and that our focus should be creating a system that is voter-centric and efficient and inspires trust in our electorate. So let's talk about post-election data for just a minute. We live in this era where data is almost ambient. It's everywhere, right? We live and breathe and work with data flowing all around us, and nothing, there's never been, I think, a better time in elections to be in a place where we start to be data-centric and data-driven. So how do we do that, and how do we capture that? First, we start by asking questions. So some of the things that we can think about after an election are who are our voters and how do they behave, and there's some counties out there that have done an exceptional job post-election of capturing all of this and showing this, and I'm not going to talk through all of these. I really just want to illustrate the data sources that are out there and the ways that we can think about framing questions around that. I will talk about that last one on there, though. That one has been really interesting, geomapping as something that's growing. I know we'll see more of that as we start to go through the re-precincting, but we use that in Arapahoe County as we tried to plan for vote centers to really look at geographically where our voters were located in and contrast that with the voting location that they chose to use. And most of the time, it's the closest location to them, but not always. And that's really helpful when you're trying to plan. So how do your voters behave? How well do you communicate with your voters? There's a plethora of data after an election that you can look at to try to understand if your instructions were understood, the instructions for completing a ballot, for returning a mail ballot, the information that you put on your website. The calls that come in can be really revealing. Amber talked about that earlier in changing processes to better inform voters. One of those that's new to me that I think is exciting is states and jurisdictions that are purchasing new voting equipment. Quite often now there's an electronic adjudication portion, and there's all kinds of data embedded in that. One of those things is ambiguous marks or marginal marks. And we really have the opportunity now to go in and look closer at that and how often they're made and how that ballot was interpreted because of that, and maybe come up with some better instructions or better design on our ballot. So that's an exciting thing in post-election data. How well are our processes? How effective are they? How effective is our training? So there's a lot of things that we can look at when we try to answer that question. I think one of the most effective in the county I just came from was looking at those poll worker hotline or troubleshooting logs. We did a really thorough evaluation after 2016, and one of the things that we found was a series of questions that was being called and repeated over and over again, something that was covered repeatedly in training, but obviously our training wasn't as effective as it should have been, and we weren't getting that message through, and so we went back from square one and we rebuilt our training based on the calls that were coming in and the troubleshooting logs that we saw. One of the things I put on there that I think might be interesting that's very low tech, so we're not talking about a lot of data sets or spreadsheets, is inventorying of ballots and supplies. In my prior job in Utah, one interesting thing we did after the election was to inventory all of the supplies that came back, and for about 3 or 4 elections in a row, we noticed on our inventory sheets this listing of pencils. Now, the only reason that that was interesting is because we didn't send pencils out. So we did a drill down into the root cause, and what we found is we really needed to revamp our reconciliation form. Election judges or poll workers were concerned about filling out the form correctly, and so they were bringing pencils from home so that they could do all of the tallying and then erase the numbers and fill it in a pen. How effective was your planning and your resource allocation? We've heard a number of individuals today talk about the MIT resource allocation tool, the line management tool, and that's just as effective when you're planning for an election as doing a post-election evaluation or audit. It gives you an opportunity now to plug in real data and see how that compared with what you planned for in terms of how long did voters actually have to wait and what your throughput was. And I can see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just skip through that. This is what we all want to talk about. How ballots were handled and were they tabulated correctly. So we know that there are a variety of things that we can look at to do that. We have our ballot reconciliation logs, our ballot manifests, our cast vote record, our adjudication audit logs, and chain of custody reports. Now, I know that there are a number of election officials sitting out there, and those that are listening are probably thinking, well, she captured a few of the data elements that we might look at to do some sort of audit or test or review, but she hasn't captured all of those, and you're correct. And there's a lot of information out there, and because there is so much, you would think that we, as an election body, would have captured all of that, and we would be doing these regular, robust audits and regular process reviews, and all 8,000 jurisdictions in the nation would have the world's best elections. I want to just pause for a minute, though, while we think about why and what makes it difficult to adopt those, and I want to talk about surgery and the history of surgery. So in 1846, William Morton administered ether for the first time. It was the first time that anesthesia was used in general surgery. I think you can see right away why it was a win for both the patient and the doctor. And it was quickly adopted. Within 2 months, most of the capitals in Europe were doing it, and within 6 years, of something that we saw done in just about every hospital in the country. Why is that? It was very visible and immediate effect, and folks could recognize that. And we see that, right, in the election community. We see processes or ideas such as vote centers where there's a win for the voter, there's a win for the election administrator, it's very visible and immediate, and so we adopt that. Post-election audits and risk-limiting audits and reviews are more like germ theory. So In 1877, Joseph Lister performed surgery and wanted to prove his theory about antiseptic surgery and using carbolic acid to reduce infection, and he did that by 85%. Mortality rates for those that had that process done went down considerably. But in over a generation, still less than half of surgeons were using that. And why do you think that is? It wasn't visible and it wasn't immediate. Weeks would go by after the surgery and they'd soon moved on to the other patients, or in our case, other elections. And we didn't need to think about it so much. And so I want you to think about, as we go through this presentation, how do we lessen the pain now and highlight the long-term benefits of regular, robust post-election audits and testing? And I will tell you what I think the answer is. Having been an election official in a very small jurisdiction where elections is one piece of what you do, and the other months out of the year you're issuing business licenses and you're doing planning and zoning, and you might be doing motor vehicle licenses. And so I think we need plug-and-play tools that we can give to officials to better use the data and do so in a way that's easy and efficient for them. So what does that look like? We need plain language definitions. We need to clearly outline the necessary steps and deadlines, and we need to calculate the workload. Or have a calculator to determine the workload so they know up front what that's going to look like. It involves checklists, tools, templates, a way to practice and to collaborate with one another. And so I'm going to walk you very quickly through, those of you that thought in 8 to 10 minutes I was going to tell you how to do a successful statewide risk limiting audit. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. I'm going to quickly walk through what such a playbook might look like, what such a checklist might look like, and just let you know that there are those collaborating to put some tools like this together. And a lot of these ideas I've borrowed, actually, from folks that have been doing audits for a very long time, and those are the individuals in the private sector who've been doing financial audits. And I won't read through this, but essentially they're saying the same thing. You've got to create definitions, you've got to create specifications, you've got to have the questions available so that this process becomes very routine. So when we talk about risk limiting audits from the perspective of an election administrator, so I'm not going to talk about software tools that are necessary, I'm not going to talk about the responsibilities of a state to carry out something like this on a statewide level, but I just want to give you a quick overview of what it might look like for a local election official. Most of these things I think you'll recognize you're doing already. And most of these things are things that you're already familiar with. So it might include a workbook that talks about pre-scanning, how to organize and track your ballots, creating a documented plan for doing that, for reconciling your ballots, thinking about ballot batch size and what that means and how that's going to allow you to ensure that you're not going to lose or gain any ballots throughout the process. Ballot storage containers are the most simple but most essential part of the whole audit process. Think about this. What we're saying is that for an election with 400,000 ballots, we are going to be able to pinpoint to the exact ballot to pull that for audit. And so thinking about containers, labeling those, creating unique IDs for those, and thinking about a thoughtful storage plan for those is essential. The other key element in your pre-planning or pre-scanning is your ballot manifest, some sort of tool to map where all of those ballots are stored and how. We might also, in such a playbook, talk about ballot scanning. That's something you're going to do every day, whether you only scan on election day or you scan throughout the early voting process or post-election. There are some really simple steps that you have to go through. The key one is reconciling and verifying that the number of ballots scanned matches that tracking form that you're working with every day. And so I think you can see where I'm going with this. Organization really is key. So we talk about risk limiting audits, we talk a lot about the theory, we talk about the statistics behind it, but as far as an election official is concerned, the key to a successful audit is the organization process. I'm going to skip quickly and just talk about ballot manifests because I mentioned the need to have very clear definitions. Now there are a variety of academic definitions on what a ballot manifest is. And I think this is essential for every element within the risk limiting audit process, is thinking, what's the simplest way that I can define this that's meaningful? For me, it means creating a map or a legend of how individual ballots and batches of ballots are stored. And it can be an Excel spreadsheet, it can be a paper log, it can be an electronic application that's been developed by a software developer. But it has to be independent of the voting system, and it has to be formatted in a way that shows certain fields that are going to be tied to your cast vote record. So the device that the ballot was scanned on, the unique batch number, the number of ballots that were scanned, and the storage container ID. It might look like this. I've got 2 examples here from 2 different counties in Colorado. This is for a statewide audit. If you're doing this countywide, those county names might be the names of your individual precincts. But the elements there are actually really pretty simple. It's the device, it's the batch, you can see that they're sequential, the number of ballots scanned into that batch, and then a location. And I've seen counties do something as simple for the location as just a box. I just visited a county that had 6 boxes full of ballots, and so it was box 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. We talked about ballot storage. I'll skip that one, but there's some essential steps there that are critical to a successful audit. And then reconciling each day. So again, we have these data sources that are available to us. We have our cast vote record, we have our ballot manifest, and then we have the information from our voter database or our poll book, so that we can ensure those totals are matching before we move into the audit process. And it's really critical versus waiting till the end of the election to resolve discrepancies, that daily those get researched and resolved. And this is what a cast vote record would look like. And I think that's, again, something that maybe on its face can look a little bit daunting, but really it's simple. It's going to be unique to each voting system vendor, but a successful audit means understanding what each of those fields are and what they represent and how they're going to tie all of those pieces together when you go to reconcile or audit your ballots. And so you can see here, each individual ballot's assigned a unique number, and that unique number is then identifies which tabulator or scanner it was scanned on, which batch it contains. So in the example I've blown up there, you can see ballot 44851 was scanned on tabulator 3, and it was the 97th batch scanned on that scanner. And within that 97th batch, it was the 70th ballot. So it's pretty simple, actually. And there's some other information there. The audit itself, at that point, you've done all of the hard work. And now it's just about retrieving the ballots using the system that you've set up and entering the voter markings to do a comparison. Easy, right? We all are ready to jump in and do that. And I realize that I've left, like I said, it's a really complex process, and it's not something that we're going to be able to communicate in 8 to 10 minutes. But I want you to think about audits, risk-limiting audits specifically, but other types of audits and testing like a path. It's not an immediate destination, and I think sometimes we think, I don't have the resources, I don't have the infrastructure, the laws in my state or jurisdiction are not set in a way that would allow me to do this. But if you break it apart and recognize that there are different places along the path, there are a lot of things that are low-tech and things that you can do right now to put yourself further along that path that are really fairly simple and easy to carry out. So we have a lot of work to do. We talk about definitions, and I know there was was asked to delve into these a little bit more. I think we're partway there. We've been able to take, again, some pretty complex theory and come up with some somewhat simple definitions, but I don't think it's enough. I think we need to take, I've given you 3 right here, batch level comparison audits, ballot level comparison audits, and ballot polling audits, and think about a way to simplify that even more in a way that we can see it and understand it. So just in conclusion, how do we use post-election data to focus on prevention rather than intervention? Risk-limiting audits are a great way for intervention to immediately recognize if you've got a problem with your voting equipment and make a change. But how do we think beyond that? And why only just audit and test our voting equipment? Why not audit and validate other critical components of the election system as well? I'm going to skip that because of time. So I'm focused right now on creating a collaborative with state and local election professionals and subject matter experts to do just that, to think about different points along the system, different data elements that we can look at pre and post-election, and provide tools and guidelines and best practices and assistance for jurisdictions to implement those. I think we all need to become audit experts. A lot of times we turn to the professionals, we turn to the advocacy groups or the academics to inform our legislators or to inform others on the resources we need, but I think as election administrators, we need to do that. We need to be able to confidently explain how these terms work and how these processes work so that we can be driving that policy in our own communities. Charles talked earlier about experts. We're starting to see, as he mentioned, a number of experts in the field. We have legal experts, we have communication and social media experts, data analysts and IT experts. I think we need auditing and quality control experts. But until then, because I understand the resource limitations, we need to learn to be pit crews and not cowboys, and learn to, as Ray said, steal from one another, collaborate with one another. And that's something that's in the works. I don't have time to talk about it, but a shared customizable tool to help expedite the risk limiting audit, the actual comparison process. And I'll just conclude with this. It was a statement from the National Commission on Federal Election Reform. Americans can and should expect their electoral system to be a source of national pride and a model to all the world. And as I said, we're at an exceptional time. I think that is happening, and I'm excited to be a part of that. And if you're interested in collaborating or sharing your expertise, you can know where to find me.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Am I next?
Next, Cara.
Okay.
Thank you.
Which button? Just this one? Okay.
That's right.
The middle one? Right here? Okay. Thank you for having me. My name is Cara Rahn, and I am the Voter Services Director for Chester County, Pennsylvania. I have learned a lot today, so I hope that we can be invited to participate in these again. I was first introduced to the idea of collecting data also from Charles a few years ago when I participated in a Department of State presentation. And felt at that time somewhat out of control of all the things that an election director has to manage. So what I chose to do in that time is and was inspired to start to collect the data so that I could be in control of some of the decisions or some of the factors that impacted myself and my staff. And data is a place that you can find that control and that confidence and that comfort. So for me, it was a reaction to 2016, which a lot of us, I think, over the course of today have fallen on our swords that we know we can do better or with data could be more efficient. So as an election director, as a county employee, I have a balancing act like many of us. We have to manage long lines in Chester County are a common conversation with our commissioners and myself. Meeting the expectations of the Pennsylvania Election Code. I asked a question earlier because I think there's so many really wonderful ideas here, but a lot of us are also trying to tie that back to how Pennsylvania law requires that we do certain things. So there's another piece to balance, balancing county resources. We're a government agency. We are lean, and we are obligated to be respectful to the resources that we're given to do our job and spend them wisely. And then overall, we have an obligation towards customer service. The voters on Election Day and other times throughout the year, of course, are our customers, and they will be grading us, so to speak, on the experience that they have for the 15 minutes that they're in casting their vote. So to keep that in mind, we have a customer service piece to this as well. So they were some of the drivers to me trying to understand the constraints that we were under and also still try to make those improvements moving forward. Okay. The other thing that just in general, I think a lot of industries are facing, and certainly elections are, we're at a little bit of a conflict as far as the expectation for quick service. You know, we talk a lot about everything today is fast with its technology. If you talk to a child, an hour waiting for something is torture, you know. So that is another factor that comes into play with voting, where we have rules and regulations set up and equipment and other things that are not quite set up to be as responsive as the expectation of our voters. I tease that if you ask a poll worker, how did the lines go today? They'll say, well, pretty good. If you ask a voter, one voter might say, I only had to wait 10 minutes. Another voter might say, I had to wait 10 minutes. So every voter that comes in has a different perspective, and we do need to respect those different perspectives as we go through these processes and looking for improvements. But that's hard because those expectations are literally all over the place. So just a little bit about Chester County. We have about 350,000 registered voters, 228 polling locations. We have some very small locations. We have some larger locations. So the logistics of each of those locations is pretty unique. We are a paper ballot county. We have hand-marked paper ballots, and then we also have a DRE machine in each precinct as well. As most of us know, we have a 4-year election cycle, so no election matches or mirrors the one just previous to it. So a lot of times the data that we collect really has to have some runtime in order to have some good comparisons, which is a unique hurdle for election directors. We're not at Disney. We're not taking daily data points or hourly data points. We have 2 days a year to track the information, and then sometimes we have to wait a few years to actually compare it. So if I can make a plug for anyone who hasn't jumped into the data collection game, just start collecting it. You might not know what to do with it yet, but if you miss the opportunity to collect, you're just prolonging that cycle from actually getting started, which I was equally guilty of up until about 1.5 years ago. And then, as you know, voter turnout varies. This past election, we had a 16% turnout, which is a bummer, but that's what we had. So to compare that turnout to a presidential would be silly as far as resources and efficiencies. But the expectations of the voters are the same, whether they show up every election or only every 4 years. And just to share there, we have about the equivalent of about 1,200 full-time, full-day poll workers. We average about the equivalent of about 5 full-day staff per precinct in order to keep the show going on Election Day. So I mentioned we started with the algorithm provided by the Caltech MIT research and found it extremely easy to use. We joked a little bit about my nuclear background, and I was a process improvement person there, so data was everything. And again, I went back to what I was comfortable with, is with data you can understand the situation and then spend your resources wisely on how to get after that. The other thing I like to joke is nothing can go wrong in a nuclear power plant, and nothing should go wrong on Election Day either. The pressure is there. So what we do with the data is we try to deduct where we should be spending our resources. We can't solve every data piece that comes up, but we can use our resources most efficiently and make some educated forecasts. So I just have a couple samples here to kind of show where, from a volume perspective, it may not be a big deal, but from a customer perspective, it hurts. So in this example, this last November, on the left here I show total number of voters that showed up that day and how many lines they were running. We do not have electronic poll books. We have paper poll books in Chester County. So our bottleneck is at the check-in table. One thing that we did through some anecdotal polling was we realized that the number of privacy booths and the like, we started providing clipboards even in some of our polling locations, that if someone really needed to get out and were less concerned about having a privacy booth to stand in to vote, we offered a clipboard so that we were able to let those folks get out quicker if they were in a rush, and those that wanted to wait for a privacy booth to open up had that option as well. So we just provided some simple things like that to let folks keep moving. Now, I can do that. I have paper ballots in that example. So my line focus is really at that check-in table. And I call my poll worker Sally. I know we have an Ethel and a couple, Dimple was another name. So here is an example. In this polling location, we only had a 30% turnout. We ask our poll workers just to track for us at the top of every hour how many folks are standing in line and in what line they're in. Very simple, easy for the poll workers to keep track of. They set a little alarm on their phone, jot the number down. That's all we need. Quickly, I could say to the judge of elections in this particular precinct, you need to run more lines in the morning. But the rest of the day, you could probably settle down. So if you only have so many resources, where are we going to ask them to double down? It's going to be in the morning. Now, that particular poll worker, as an example, if you walk in and you go to vote and your last name starts with a B, you're really annoyed that there's no one else in that other line, but you have to stand in a line of 10 people waiting to get your ballot checked in. That's something that a poll worker might not consider as something that they need to worry about because they're busy, they're doing their job. But from a customer satisfaction perspective, that seems like a pretty easy one to get after. So this is an example of something we would share with that judge of elections. At as low as a 30% turnout, we already have a problem. What are we going to do at a 40, a 50, a 60% turnout? So instead of having a conversation that sounds like the election director is telling the elected poll worker how to do something differently, we're using data to normalize that conversation and then together come up with solutions that we think might work for this particular precinct. And this goes for any other business that you stand in line and you're annoyed that there's 15 closed checkouts and there's only 2 people working and there's a huge line. It's a similar feeling that I think people have when they walk into a polling location. So this one, not a large turnout, 395 folks all day, 16% turnout. They had a small line all day. One more person would have satisfied no one having to wait at this precinct at all for that day. So in a 16% turnout, I would likely not spend a lot of time trying to fix this precinct. But in a presidential or a gubernatorial election, I'm going to make sure that this judge of elections is not running the precinct the same way that they always do, because this is not going to work for a higher turnout. So again, the data allows me to have the conversation in a less threatening way, since we all here in Pennsylvania have elected poll workers to try to manage or work with. And then what we do too is we ask if the poll workers are able to, or they have the time, in our numbered list of voters book, which is another tool that our poll workers are required to use, to track at the top of each hour, just right next to the person's name, who is in line at that hour, so that we actually can then go further to see how many people voted in that particular hour just by taking a quick look at our numbered list of voters book. So that's another way for us to see if the line's consistent all day, or if it just so happened to be at the top of that hour there was a line. And these are simple things that we can ask our poll workers to do on the spot versus while we're putting out the other fires like tornadoes and the like back at the office. So we do not have, I mentioned, we do not have e-poll books. We're looking for something else like that to take us to the next level within the polling location as we look for new equipment. But I think that it's important for us to realize that the volume is likely not going to change coming into the polls. Where the line builds is what's going to change. So we need to consider, if we fix kind of that whack-a-mole game, if we fix one, it will likely create an issue or a line somewhere else. So I'm really trying to take the data that I'm using now, even to go into what type of new election equipment I'm going to purchase, so that I'm really looking at the big picture and not just the lines that are forming at the front desk, because that will likely dissipate or hopefully not become an issue at all if we select the technology to help us along there. So the other thing is that we've talked about a little bit is our poll workers. There's a learning curve. Anything new can be scary sometimes, but what we've decided to do is build in the data collection as part of their poll worker training, as if it's just another thing that's expected to be done at the polls that day. What we did in the beginning was we asked for it as an add-on, and we got a very low response rate from our poll workers. The new poll workers are coming in, and we're just kind of making it part of our process, and we're up over 50% now on our return rate. The other thing we're learning is making sure that the way that we're training to collect the data is important. Bad data is not going to get us anywhere. So we've had some interesting responses to our form that didn't quite match what we were looking for. So we're still working through it. We have absolutely not arrived, but we're trying, and I feel confident already with the data that we do have, the pockets of the polling locations that we maybe need to put some more resources to. I think bottom line, even with the data collection, is that in Pennsylvania, our poll workers are still the most critical piece to the puzzle. They need to be educated, they need to be willing and interested, as I am, towards this data and towards that customer experience and the customer satisfaction. What happens on election day can make or break the reputation of the county, frankly, of someone's experience. So what we're doing, just to show an example of what we're doing with the data besides just coaching our judges of elections on what we could do better, is we're now using the data to look at where the pockets are of where we're having a hard time finding poll workers, to take the show on the road and go to businesses who maybe they offer days off if you do a United Way Community Day. Well, maybe they can add poll workers to the list of opportunities that their employees could have the day off if they're going to go offer some civic support in the polls. It's a nonpartisan effort. It's servicing their community. Why aren't we looking at servicing our polling locations like we do other nonprofit opportunities throughout the year? We go to Rotary clubs. We'll talk to college students. High school students. We have some very active honor society groups that will send us student poll workers, and they're amazing. And they're a really nice balance to the generational mix that we have in our polling locations now. And then I think we're also going to need to identify which polling locations this data is requiring us to do more of a hands-on survey or field review versus just collecting the data from the poll workers to get after what they might need specifically. We talk a little bit about the characteristic of each precinct. We have some where the nursing home bus loads up and goes to vote at 10 a.m. So that particular location has a different set of needs and expectations in a different time of day than a heavy commuter area where the rush is going to build at 7 a.m. So to treat everyone the same is, I think, a waste of county resources. We really need to kind of dig in to get the specificity that the data can provide us, and also the comfort to know that there are certain precincts that are doing just fine, and we have the data to feel comfort in that and not just the anecdotes that we might hear from our poll workers or from others. Okay, so that was it. Thank you.
Bridgett?
Oh, here you go. So it's this button here.
Let's break it. Thank you. Ready,
Oh,
Bridget?
yeah, as I'm going to be.
Great.
So in many ways, it's appropriate that I'm going last, because what I hope to do in this presentation is talk about the role of evaluation and leave you with some thoughts about how you might approach that while integrating some of the things people have talked about throughout the day with respect to the way they have used innovation to address the challenges they've experienced in their jurisdictions. And also try not to break the clicker. Okay. Oh, look at that. All right. So evaluation is effectively the systematic investigation of the merit, worth, or significance of any object. And so when we think about this as it relates to election administration, Evaluation is really an opportunity. It's an opportunity to gather data and demonstrate the ways in which policies or programs that have been enacted in jurisdictions and that can enhance the way you do your jobs, and perhaps more broadly, the way citizens experience the democratic process. And so while we often think of evaluation in real social scientific terms, it clearly doesn't need to be. It can be, the nature of evaluation can take on a variety of forms. It can be very descriptive, just thinking about gains and reductions, or also be statistically rigorous. But regardless of the approach, evaluation should be something that isn't intimidating, but something that you view as a resource or a tool that can continually be utilized as we think about ways to improve and enhance the administration of elections. And so why do this? If you haven't been convinced yet, here are some other reasons. So one reason to engage in evaluation is that it allows you to, am I too close to this? It allows you to establish model programs and best practices by providing feedback about what worked and what didn't work. So if you can think about some of the voter outreach and information approaches people have discussed, poll worker training, also the way in which equipment is delivered to polling sites, all of these things are opportunities to consider places for improvement. If we think about public administration more broadly, evaluation is a tool of good management and quality improvement. It can be used to gain insight into effective strategies on how to improve performance, measure impact, improve implementation and effectiveness, better manage limited resources. One theme that's consistently been discussed throughout the day is the best way to utilize limited resources that people who work in elections have. It's also an opportunity for you to document program accomplishments, to justify current program funding, to perhaps convince the powers that be that you need a little more money. And also, evaluation is an opportunity to satisfy ethical responsibility to the public and demonstrate the positive and negative effects of things you might be doing in your office. And so this is particularly true if we think about the ways in which society is increasingly concerned about accountability and results. Evaluation is the opportunity to demonstrate what you did, why you did it, and how it benefited the public. And beyond that is an opportunity for you to contribute to the body of knowledge that exists in the area of election administration, to share with your peers what it is that you're doing, the successes that you had, and allow them the information so they can think about how they might integrate what worked for you in their particular jurisdiction. And so, just like we've talked about there being a variety of ways to address challenges, there are also a variety of approaches to think about what sort of solutions are going to be in the best interest for your particular office on the front end. And so one approach to doing this is a logic model. And so a logic model is basically just a map. It is a simplified picture of a program, initiative, or intervention that is responsive to a given situation. It requires you to think about the resources you need to prioritize the problem or challenge you're currently facing, and perhaps not most importantly, but also importantly, it requires you to think about the short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes of the intervention you implement. And those things are often measurable, right? And so it allows you to think about what it is that you need to do in order to address your specific issue. And so a situation is simply just a challenge. So if we think about the beginning of the logic model, it's a challenge that you're faced with, whether it be the result of a particular problem you've experienced in a previous election, or if you're just thinking about ways to enhance what voters experience on election day. You would then think about sort of what resources you have to allocate to address to this particular problem, what it is that you're going to do, and then again, like I said earlier, what the outcomes are going to be once you implement whatever policy or practice you've decided to use. Here is, Here is an election administration specific logic model that was produced by two of my colleagues, Drs. Kathleen Hale and Mitchell Brown. And so if you look at this particular logic model, you can see to the far left that the issue discussed in this particular jurisdiction is low voter turnout, and then below that you see the resources that are going to be necessary to address this particular problem, and then immediately to the right of the problem you see the activity that in this particular scenario they've decided to focus on, which is a nonpartisan reminder that is sent before the election. And so if you consider short-term outcomes, obviously one thing would be that hopefully the voter shows up to vote. But if we think beyond that, you can think about a person becoming a consistent voter, so voting regularly in elections. And then more broadly, you can think about increased democratic functioning as we think about participation being an important component of living in a representative democracy. So in thinking about the types of evaluation, there are many, and here are just 4. And so in listening to the presentations throughout the day, we've in very not so direct ways kind of discussed all of them, but I'm going to share them with you anyway. So the first is the formative or planning phase. This might be where you would introduce a logic model and to address a specific issue. But the idea is that you, during this phase, will think about what is actually feasible, appropriate, or acceptable. And so that clearly is going to vary from one jurisdiction to the next because we all face different challenges or opportunities in different environments, whether they be related to our resources, the political environment, et cetera. But the beauty of this particular phase of evaluation is that it shows you, or it should help you understand the extent to which the program is going to be needed, or understood. And it's useful for making modifications before you make a major investment into any approach to address a particular problem. Okay. So the next type of evaluation is process evaluation. And so this is the type of evaluation you would engage in once you have begun a program and throughout it. And so it's basically monitoring. And so if we think about the situation in Colorado or in other states where we look at peaks and valleys in voter turnout and think about the ways in which we might better allocate resources, that's an example of process evaluation. And so the beauty of process evaluation is it lets you see over the length of your program how well it's working, and can also alert you to any challenges with respect to the protocol that you might need to address to ensure it is as successful as you anticipate it to be to address the challenge that you initially began with. There's also outcome effectiveness evaluation, which is kind of self-explanatory, but it basically allows you to determine or assess the extent to which you are making steady progress towards your ultimate goal. It's useful because obviously it lets you know if the program is being effective, and allows you to also sort of engage in some monitoring in that particular process as well. And then lastly, you have impact evaluation, which basically is there to just allow you to determine if you did in fact achieve your ultimate goal. And it's also useful because it will allow you to provide evidence or data to think about whether or not you're going to proceed with the program in the future, to allow you to assess the extent to which what you did was efficient and effective, and also allow you to think about if perhaps when you do it in the future, or if you do it in the future, if you need to increase the scale at which you approach this particular activity, because it was just so amazing. Thank you. All right. So in thinking about the different approaches to evaluation, one might ask themselves, well, which approach is right? And the answer is, it depends. This is like being in one of my classes. There are no answers. But there are questions you can ask yourself to get a sense of what type of evaluation is going to be the most useful given the phase of your project. So one question is to ask yourself about utility. So who is going to need the information from this evaluation, and what is it specifically do they need? You would also ask yourself, how feasible is it? So how much money, time, or effort can you actually put into the evaluation? You're also going to think about propriety, who needs to be involved in the evaluation to be ethical, and then lastly, what design will lead to accurate information? And so thinking about what you just said earlier about all data isn't good. You need good data to do good evaluation, to make good decisions. So the idea about evaluation is effectively to be thoughtful and sort of think sooner rather than later about what it is that you're doing and what kind of questions you would like to be able to answer when you're done, so that you can identify and think about and collect data that will allow you to complete the kind of evaluation that is most useful and add value to the work that you do in the field more broadly. Oh, and thank you.
Thank you, Bridgett. Great. Well, thank you all to the panel. I have a couple of questions. Do I still have enough time to ask some questions? Great. I'll start with Ray. Ray, when we were talking on the phone before in planning for this, you described your check-in system as an e-poll book on steroids. And since my first job in this field was as a poll worker, I'm particularly curious about how the poll worker training went, both from the start to the finish, like when you announced that you were having this e-poll book on steroids, and what the process was, and how the poll workers handled it.
Just to let you know that I took a tour of Philly, and they said that 9 out of 10 times the answer is Ben Franklin or cheesesteak. But that doesn't answer that. So, truthfully, it was actually a robust. We have re-implemented what we call Deputy Registrar program, which in Arizona you had to be a Deputy Registrar 19-0 to register somebody. That went away. Anybody can register. We actually reinstated it, not because of registration, but to train up folks and give them a certification, because it's still in statute. And part of it was grabbing all of our poll workers and saying, we want you to be experts in the process, so come back 100 at a time on every Saturday. And I mean this as in the tone that I'm saying. Every Saturday I was there prior to our launch. And we launched this when we told our IT, just as a point of reference, 2017, April 1st, 2017. They thought it was an April Fool's joke that we wanted this launched by November 2017, within a few months. And Bill Gates didn't even think we could do it. And Bill Gates is a councilman in Arizona, not the real Bill Gates. But just so you know, we like to say that. But probably the real Bill Gates probably thought we couldn't do it as well. But what we've done is we brought in our board workers, 100 at a time on weekends, Saturdays, Sundays, and what you saw on that screen was our sandbox, was a demo board worker polling place setup. And one of the things that bringing them in, we wanted them to touch this pre-check-in. We're basically saying, you're now in the back of that, behind that ballot man, walking, waiting for somebody to raise their hand to say, little blinking light, show me your ID. That's basically TSA. You can pre-check in, get your boarding pass, but they don't get their ballot till they show that ID. But that's all they were doing. So unless they needed assistance, 99% of the people. So we walked them through. One of the key things that they loved about us is because it is somewhat technical equipment, we have launched a T-Tech program where we set up the whole polling places. So all of and we are in a vote center model as well, so we're doing a lot of things to taper down our polling places. So we go and set those up. The board workers, all they need to do is show up with and we have an inspector and a backup inspector that has a badge that launches those site books, opens up the payroll program, which is the most important thing for them to check in. And they don't do anything on election night other than secure the ballots and bring in the edge cartridge, so to speak, our touchscreen, and they don't even touch those. So part of the training was to have them go through that environment, and kind of like Dimples, who maybe was a little bit hesitant. The first time we thought, well, you can't do this, you can't, we walked them through. We actually lined them up outside the corridor 100 at a time and said, we're going to walk you through and have you vote and print an actual ballot. And they looked at us and we said, on our schedule, it said 15 minutes. And they said, this is an hour. We're board workers. We know this takes an hour. 15 minutes with that pre-check-in process. And one key thing about that pre-check-in is it goes so fast that we do get a backlog of people waiting for the ballot to be printed. But even that, the one thing, the feedback we got was they didn't mind that. They don't mind waiting 5-6 minutes to get their ballot. They've been checked in. They feel served. So it's not that if it is busy and we gotten to that point where those 100 people coming in, that they still said that they got to commingle with their neighbors, but not outside wondering what's going on. Instead, they know they've been served and they're just waiting for that. So our part of it was our training was, to this day, we have nothing but 100% positive feedback from both Ethel and our Step Up teenage program groups that actually are big and helpful in this technology.
That's great. Thank you. All right, I'll just go in order. Jennifer, I know you said it's complicated, but I'm going to ask you to do something hard. And just, can you, so let's say hypothetically I'm on the phone for 45 minutes with, a particular county election official, and I need to explain what the difference is, say, between risk limiting audits and other kind of post-election audits. Can you give me an elevator speech?
What was that? 7
He
minutes?
said it was 47 minutes that he was on the phone with me the other night.
So I think one of the most important things to think about when you think about post-election audits, so 25 states nationally do some type of post-election audit that's based on a flat formula, right? We take 3% of ballots or 1,000 ballots, and it doesn't matter what the margin is of the races that are being audited, it's a flat rate. What's different about risk-limiting audits is, first of all, we're basing the sample size on the margin. So the closer, the tighter the margin is, makes sense, right? Or we want to audit more ballots. And the wider that is, we're going to decrease. And so we gain some efficiencies there. The other important element of that is that we institute this idea of randomness. So instead of just grabbing the top batch in a box of ballots, or the first scanner that happens to be lined up in our warehouse, we're going to go through this process of randomly selecting those all the way to the point of the best practice, or the recommendation is to actually start with a random seed. I think a lot of you have seen our dice rolling event in Colorado. Well, the whole point of that, it doesn't have to be dice, is that we eliminate any possibility for somebody to try to manipulate the system. So we create a random seed. We plug that into a pseudo-random number generator. I'm looking at Mark to make sure I get my terms right. And we use that to do a very random sampling of our whole pool of ballots based on the margins, based on the diluted margin, meaning the difference between the winner and the loser divided by the total number of ballots that were cast in that race. And then we set a risk limit. And so we may say, for instance, that our risk limit is going to be 5%. And this is where I stumble a little bit. But what we're saying essentially is there is a 5% chance that at the end of this audit we will not have caught any issues or something that would have changed the outcome of the audit. And I think that particular part, defining a risk limit, to me has been the most challenging. And I've been called to task on that a number of times. And every time I get to the end, I get a blank look. And so there's got to be a better, easier way to communicate, one, what a risk limit is. But I think the important thing when we talk about a traditional audit versus a risk-limiting audit is that we are basing it on the margin of victory when we're doing it in a way that is a random sampling process. And then I guess the third thing is it's not essential, so it's not absolute that we do a ballot comparison audit. And I talked about that, and we're fortunate, states that central count have the advantage to be able to do that. So we're going to go pinpoint an exact ballot. We're going to take a look at that, and we're going to evaluate the voter markings on that compared with the way that the election system tabulated that. But there are opportunities within that risk-limiting audit theory to do what is called a batch-level comparison audit. So we may be in a precinct count, a voter-facing scanner, precinct polling place model where we may not be able to pinpoint right to that ballot. Now, that's not the most effective. I think there will be a lot of argument to go to a ballot level comparison, but that's another term that I think we start to throw those two terms around, ballot level, batch level. What does that mean? How do we explain that in a way that's easy for voters as well as election officials to understand? And I didn't answer that, but that is essentially taking the batch and hand counting the batch and then comparing the totals of that to the totals from the equipment on that batch. So how did I do?
You said you're working on a really user-friendly thing, right?
That's the plan.
So you'll keep in touch and let us know, and we can circulate it to everybody?
Absolutely.
Awesome, thank you. Because I know I'm going to get feedback. Cara, can I ask you, talking about the data that you're doing, as you know, in Pennsylvania, we're going to be transitioning across the state to new systems. What would you, can we learn from the data that you're collecting? Where would you start if you were advising, we're going to have, line management is going to be changing, right, with different systems, and some counties are going to be going from DRE machines to hand-marked paper ballots or some combination. Where would you start if you were advising a county that was going to make a change? What would be the first set of steps they should take to start the line management data collection?
Well, can't tell if it's on.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So the first thing that I would share for anyone in Pennsylvania is I'd be happy to share the model that we use, which we, I forget what R&D stood for, but we robbed and duplicated as well. So I'll share that just in the same vein. But the voter turnout and the voter characteristics and the voter details that you have now are likely not going to change with whatever equipment that you get. Their regular voting patterns are going to likely stay the same. And of course, a lot of us have been caught off guard from time to time with political landscape and changes there. But for the most part, if you can understand voter flow now, you can use that data to then apply it to what the efficiencies you may be able to get from that future equipment. Because your voters are still going to be the same. They're still going to show up at 7 or at 10 or at 7:59 in Pennsylvania. We close at 8 p.m. and we always have folks rushing in at the last minute, certainly. So I would say that you just have to start. And you can start as soon as November. And I'd be happy to share the tools that we're using, and it's very easy for our poll workers to understand. And then also start now getting the buy-in from our poll workers in Pennsylvania that we need their help with this data. This is not a reflection on how they're doing. They're absolutely doing the best that they can do, but none of us can move that ball without the data that only they can collect for us on Election Day. So like I had to do, I just had to kind of rip the Band-Aid off and jump in and start collecting the data. It's daunting for an election director to worry about all the things that we worry about. Once we got the ball rolling, it's very common for us now, and it's a very doable program.
Well, thank you for offering to share your resources, because I'm sure it's very appreciated by the other counties. Can I ask one more question before going into it? Okay. Bridgett, unless you don't want me to ask a question. You know, I was curious, you know, with the power of storytelling, if you have an example of a circumstance where, you know, the kind of process that you were talking about with evaluation really made a difference from going from a problem to a solution that had, you know, you talked about short-term, medium-term, long-term. Do you have an example where you could just share? And I'm sorry, if you don't, we'll go to audience questions.
So I have a kind of story.
Stories are
Like
good. And
story,
you could make it up.
story.
if you
Oh, you want me to
appreciate it.
lie?
If
That's
it's
terrible. We
Illustrative.
just talked about good data and information all day. So it's not so much a story about me watching the process work through with a specific to address a specific solution, but I can tell you about conversations I've had about people who have used it. So one of the things that I and my colleagues at Auburn do in our work with the Election Center is we spend a lot of time talking to election officials from around the country about challenges they are facing and the ways in which they address them. And so what I have found, this is like a half answer. So what I have found, though, when through some of the courses we present the logic model to them, the reaction tends to be very positive. So on the one hand, there's a lot of griping about, oh, another activity that I have to sit through and do. But then what I see is when people actually sit down and think about what it is that they actually need to do and the resources they're going to need to commit and sort of what their actual outcome is. So just beyond the short term, we want people to vote, or beyond, we want people to understand when a specific deadline is, but thinking about the bigger picture of how election administration fits into this thing that we like to call democracy. I've seen perhaps the biggest impact beyond that end when people step outside of themselves and their specific circumstance and think about how their decisions impact their communities and states and the country more broadly. That's my non-answer.
Great. That was a great non-answer. Thank you again. Do I have time for audience questions? Can't actually see that far. Okay, great. Are there audience questions? Yeah. Yeah. No audience questions. Is there still chocolate?
I have just one more thing to say is that when we talk about the top side, I just want to let you know in Arizona, we do have we don't have tornadoes, but we have rain. And I just wanted you to know that when it rains, that is our natural disaster. I just want, yeah.
Right.
I was making notes here and I said I got to make sure to ask about tornadoes. I never heard of them.
Great. Well, we do actually have some audience questions. So are there, I'm sorry, the bright lights are a little blinding, but you got a question? Okay.
Hi, I'm Paris Hoter. I'm a consultant and looking into what all of you are doing that's so terrific. And I'm a CPA from Wall Street originally, so there's some very interesting subjects going on here. One of you brought up the question of precinct surveying. And I was wondering, have any of you, since some of you in the audience who have already been on the dais have talked about setting up your email structure with your clients and constituency, those of you like in Pennsylvania where you don't have that necessarily, that ability and stuff, how are you, all of you, looking at communicating? And so many online tools are made for surveying and getting feedback. Are we looking into that as something that you're going to be rolling out? How are people rolling it out? Have they rolled it out? Are you clear on what I was talking about? I'm talking about, you talked about customer satisfaction. You talked about getting feedback as to what does the voter really need. And you're kind of doing it in a paper way, I gathered, at the moment. But obviously an online, monkey tool or something like that would be so efficient. Are we looking at that kind of communication for this industry?
For Maricopa, we actually did utilize SurveyMonkey. It's a unique name there, but and we got positive feedback because we're rolling out something new, and we really wanted that. So we had the ability to know who's checked in. We go back to our voter registration, who has emails, who has text, or given us a cell phone, and we responded in a short, brief 5-question. And we're looking future forward because we can build our site book and without having to go, and again, not to bash third-party vendors, but we can tweak this as much as we want without a cost to it. We're going to actually add. We need to slow down our check-in process. It's so fast to backlog the Starbucks waiting for your caramel macchiato ballot kind of thing. So we're actually going to have that part of that end process. Would you like to take a 2-question, 5-star? Did you wait? And I don't know Don Palmer's not here or not, but we're partnering with the bipartisan to do. We'll be able to do some line studies, have people wear a badge, drop at the end of the line when you come in, help us service. But all of that survey stuff we're already doing now. I actually just got my text that how was my early voting experience. So we were already implementing that text, and because I cast before I left, and I should tell them how 5-star the director is. And so, anyways, but so we're already implementing, and I know that I seen this. I heard it today on the text, the email. So it's just more involved, but at least in Maricopa, we are already looking at that survey structure.
I can say in Chester County, we are not there yet, frankly, but we are jealous, and we'd like to. We have the energy towards trying to understand those perspectives in a data-driven way, in addition to maybe the anecdotal comments that the general public may provide. I talked a little earlier about everyone's version of 10 minutes is very different, so it's hard to chase that. But if we have the data and then maybe the additional anecdotal after that, then that would, I think, give us a nice marriage of information. So not yet. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah.
There's a,
Oh, sorry.
oh, sorry.
Right here. Oh, yeah, I'm Sarah Brannon. I'm an attorney with the Voting Rights Project at the ACLU.
And I just had a general question. I was really interested in Maricopa County. When did you guys adopt the vote centers? And then what are the parameters for, I mean, can you go anywhere in the whole county to use any vote center? And I also noticed you mentioned on your slide that you have real-time ballot printing capacity. So, I mean, this just seems like such an efficiency to prevent people from going to the wrong location. So if you could also speak to how well it actually works to do. I know sometimes real-time ballot printing can be very time-consuming, but of course it helps voters a great deal. So I'd be interested to know a little bit about what experience you guys have had with that specifically too.
We try not to speak to the ACLU or. No, actually, we work with Sarah. We know that Sarah has been working with us, and we are very. But as far as the process itself, we all of the vote centers we've been using theoretically for almost a decade with early voting, meaning it's been a vote anywhere. Early voting, we had ballot on demand. We've always had that, but the ballot on demand system we had took 8 minutes to print a ballot. But it was not low turnout. So we just literally in January 1 of 2017 is when we got a new model of ballot on demand that could do it in 30 seconds or less. And that's when we started saying with that kind of ability that we can offer this. So we added that to an election day environment for local. I will say that Arizona still has a statute that doesn't allow for vote anywhere on election day for a federal election. So these 2018, we were going to be running a hybrid. And are there any Arizona legislators in here? Well, those, no, I'm just kidding, because this is national. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I mean, I forgot that. But no, the fact is that it takes a lot of data to prove your process, to prove your. So we have done it for local elections throughout this local election. Some of the numbers you saw were actually vote anywhere local election November, 1 million voters, but still it was not a full statewide or federal election. This election, they have allowed us to run a hybrid, meaning we will still have precinct-based, consolidated locations that we won't call vote centers, but there's 2 precincts showing up to 1 location. That's how we're, not skirting the law, that's not the right way to say that. We don't fix elections, we don't, but we're consolidating locations for this 2018 to do a hybrid, and we will have 40 locations that will be vote anywhere, but we are advertising that if you go there, they're not precinct-based, so we're doing a happy medium, but right now you're correct that what the numbers you saw there were for a vote center for all our locals, and this 18 will be hybrid.
Asking is a good model to promote to other states, not from an aggressive perspective, because that 30 seconds, that's fabulous. Like,
Yeah,
that's
that's
just
amazing.
such a great efficiency, and I'm actually very fascinated. That's great you guys are doing a model, because hopefully you will get some good data to promote perhaps a legislative change.
And that's the beauty of this data summit, because we're going to draw this data to, I even talked with Amber about her great infographics that she does. We're going to rob her graphic folks, and because we need to promote this a better way to our legislatures to say, this is what the data shows is where we want to go.
Is there one more question? Yes, looks like over here.
Sorry.
Well, what I wanted to ask, the whole issue of evaluation, can that be used to also verify that a voter voted the way they wanted to vote, that votes can't be changed afterwards? Like, is there a process to track that? I mean, that's one of my main concerns is with the security of the elections, that the evaluation process, especially like what was spoken of today, will that help to verify that the election is true and honest?
You want to address that?
I will answer that. So that's exactly what the audit does. That's exactly what the risk limiting audit does. And so it's looking at 2 things, right? It's making sure that the voting equipment operated the way that it was programmed to operate. So did it tabulate the ballot the way that the ballot was marked? But the interesting thing that we found throughout the process was it didn't just validate the voting equipment, but it also validated our training of poll workers, of election judges in adjudicating voter intent. And that's really critical, especially to what you were speaking about. If a voter marks a ballot, and let's assume they don't mark it exactly the way that the instructions provide, they make a mistake or they overvote a race or some other situation happens that it would require a set of election judges or poll workers to evaluate that and make a decision, the audit verifies that that was done correctly. Now, one thing that's really important, I think, is for states to think about adopting uniform voter intent guidelines. It's really helpful so that county by county, we're not making different decisions on what is a correctly marked ballot. But yes, the audit verifies both of those.
If I may just add, in front of that, we also, similar to what we have is a ballot status, or Colorado has ballot trace. Some of that lends credibility to say, your ballot has been received. It's in process. My next email or text will be your ballot has been verified and counted. Now the audit then says we've done logic and accuracy, has it counted? So you got a lot of front end for the individuals when we started rolling these out and people start robbing and duplicating some of this text process and email process that soon will be standard, I think, with all of our election folks.
Great. Thank you so much. What great questions and even better answers. So thank you very much to this panel, and that will conclude the panel. And I'd like to introduce closing remarks will be given by Vice Chair Krista McCormick. Yeah.
So thank you all for staying through. Those of you who have stayed are the ones who need the most therapy on your OCD disorder. Let me offer my sincere thanks to the Community College of Philadelphia for hosting us here today. They are very generous with their space, and we thank them for that. Acting Secretary Robert Torres and our partners at the Pennsylvania Department of State, especially Jess Myers and Mike Moser, who dedicated countless hours to making this event possible, and your microphone folks as well. I want to thank our EAC staff, especially David Kennett and Natalie, and who else is here? Brenda, Brian. So many of folks on our team helped put this together, and I just want to thank you for all your hard work on that. I want to thank all of our moderators and panelists for spending the time they did to put their presentations together. We appreciate their time and commitment and their expertise and contributions to today's discussions. And all of our audience members, including those of you who followed online today, thank you so much. Henry and your IT folks back there too, thank you so much. Let me also invite you all to check out the EAC's website to learn more about our recent and upcoming research and data initiative, including the 2018 Election Administration and Voting Survey. And there were hard copies back there. I don't know if there are still any left there. You can find this information on the eac.gov website under the Research and Data tab, as well as on our blog. Lastly, I want to invite you all to another event that we have in the works for later this month. On Tuesday, July 24th in Washington, D.C. I think it's at the museum, is that right? We are hosting the 3rd annual Language Access for Voters Summit, which is being organized in partnership with Arizona State University's Pastor Center and the Democracy Fund's Voice. This event will convene election officials and language community representatives to discuss how election officials can meet their language assistance requirements under the Voting Rights Act and better serve their voters with language needs. So with that, I just want to thank you all for spending your day with us. I hope you found this to be educational and generate some innovative ideas, and we look forward to our next Election Data Summit. Thanks so much.